The dust of the auction block settled like ash from a dying fire, coating everything in the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge with the same dull brown that seemed to permeate every corner of life in 1878. The wooden platform stood in the center of the makeshift marketplace, surrounded by crude stalls selling everything from saddles to snake oil. But today it held something different, something that made the usual crowd of merchants, cowboys, and townspeople shift uncomfortably in their boots. She stood there in chains, her back straight despite the weight of iron shackles around her wrists and ankles. The woman they called the last Apache captive was perhaps 25 years old, though the hardships etched into her weathered face made it difficult to tell. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her eyes, those eyes held depths that spoke of mountains, of sacred places, of a world that no longer existed. The crude sign hanging around her neck read Sarah in hastily scrawled letters, a name forced upon her by men who could not pronounce the Apache words that carried her true identity. The auctioneer, a portly man named Jeremiah Hartwell, wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the reluctant crowd. This was not the kind of merchandise that moved quickly these days. The Apache Wars had ended, the tribes scattered or destroyed, and what remained was the uncomfortable aftermath that nobody quite knew how to handle. The woman was a remnant, a living reminder of conflicts most people preferred to forget. "Now then, folks," Hartwell called out, his voice carrying across the dusty square, "we have here the final piece from the recent settlement with the cavalry. Healthy specimen, young enough to be useful, trained in domestic work." His words rang hollow even to himself. Everyone present knew this was not about domestic work or useful labor. This was about what to do with the inconvenient survivor of a war that had left no room for the conquered. The crowd murmured among themselves, but no hands rose. A few men in worn cowboy hats exchanged glances, while shopkeepers' wives pulled their children closer and whispered behind gloved hands. The woman on the platform remained motionless, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the assembled faces, as if she could see through them to a horizon that called to her still. Minutes passed like hours. Hartwell cleared his throat and lowered the starting price, then lowered it again. Still nothing. The uncomfortable silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the sound of horses stomping and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was then that Thomas Mitchell stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Tom Mitchell was not the kind of man who drew attention in gatherings like this. At 42 years old, he possessed the lean, weathered build of someone who had spent decades wrestling a living from unforgiving land. His farm sat 8 miles outside of Cedar Ridge, a modest spread of wheat fields and grazing land that he had worked alone since his wife Mary died of fever 3 years prior. The townspeople knew him as reliable but distant, a man who kept to himself and spoke only when spoken to. His clothes were clean but patched, his boots worn but well-maintained. There was something in his quiet demeanor that suggested depths, not immediately apparent. Perhaps it was the way his gray eyes seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing, or the careful precision with which he moved, as if every gesture had been considered and found necessary. Tom had come to town that morning for supplies, not expecting to find himself standing at an auction block watching a human being sold like livestock. Something in the sight unsettled him in ways he could not fully articulate. Perhaps it was the woman's dignity in the face of degradation, or perhaps it was something deeper, some recognition of isolation that resonated with his own solitary existence. He had lost Mary to the fever during a particularly harsh winter, and since then his world had contracted to the boundaries of his property. The farmhouse, once filled with her laughter and the promise of children who never came, now echoed with emptiness. He rose before dawn, tended his animals, worked his fields, and fell into bed each night, exhausted enough to avoid the dreams that haunted his sleep. The townspeople had tried, in their way, to help him through his grief. Widow Patterson had brought casseroles, the preacher had offered counsel, and several well-meaning families had invited him for Sunday dinners. But Tom found himself unable to accept their kindness, unable to pretend that their attempts at comfort could fill the void that Mary's absence had carved into his life. Standing there in the dust and heat of the auction square, watching the crowd's discomfort with the business at hand, Tom felt something stir within him that had been dormant for years. It was not pity exactly, nor was it charity in any conventional sense. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of one lost soul by another. When Hartwell called for bids a third time, his voice growing desperate, Tom found himself raising his hand before conscious thought could intervene. $50, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Heads turned, conversation stopped mid-sentence, and even the woman on the platform shifted her gaze to look at him directly for the first time. Hartwell blinked in surprise, then recovered quickly, as if afraid Tom might change his mind. $50 from Mr. Mitchell, the auctioneer called out with obvious relief. Do I hear 60? Silence answered him. The crowd seemed too stunned by this unexpected development to respond. Some stared at Tom with open amazement, others with something approaching suspicion. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, clutched her husband's arm and whispered urgently in his ear. A group of cowboys near the back began muttering among themselves, shaking their heads. $50 going once, Hartwell continued, his gavel poised. Going twice. Sold to Thomas Mitchell for $50. The sound of the gavel striking wood seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. Tom felt the weight of every eye in the crowd upon him as he stepped forward to complete the transaction. His hands remained steady as he counted out the bills, money he had intended to spend on seed for next spring's planting, and placed them in Hartwell's eager palm. The keys to the shackles were produced, and Tom found himself face to face with the woman whose life had just become inexplicably intertwined with his own. Up close, he could see that her eyes were not simply dark but held flecks of amber that caught the afternoon light. There was intelligence there, and wariness, and something else he could not quite identify. Name's Tom Mitchell, he said quietly, extending his hand to help her down from the platform. She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then at his face, as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, she placed her freed hands briefly in his and stepped down onto the dusty ground. Her grip was calloused from hard work, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. They call me Sarah, she said, her English accented but clear. But that is not my name. Tom nodded, understanding more than she might have expected. I figured as much, he replied. You can tell me your real name when you're ready. The crowd had begun to disperse, but not without lingering stares and whispered conversations that would undoubtedly grow into full-blown gossip by evening. Tom ignored them as he led the way to his wagon, conscious of the woman walking beside him with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned not to trust solid ground. The ride to his farm was conducted in silence, but it was not the uncomfortable quiet of strangers. Instead, it carried the weight of two people taking stock of a situation neither had fully anticipated. Tom kept his eyes on the road ahead, while the woman who was not really named Sarah studied the landscape rolling past them with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they reached the Mitchell farm. The house was modest but well-maintained, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the light. Behind it stretched fields of wheat that rustled softly in the evening breeze, and beyond that, pasture land where a few cattle grazed peacefully. Tom brought the wagon to a stop near the front steps and climbed down, then moved around to offer his assistance. This time, the woman accepted his help without hesitation, though she examined everything around her with the careful attention of someone assessing potential threats and escape routes. There's a room upstairs, Tom said, his voice carefully neutral. It's got a good lock on the inside of the door, if that makes you feel safer. She tilted her head slightly, studying his face. Why did you buy me? She asked directly. It was a fair question, and one Tom had been asking himself during the entire ride home. I'm not rightly sure, he admitted. Seemed like the thing to do at the time. And now? Tom considered this. Now I reckon we'll figure it out as we go along. Inside the house, the silence felt different than it had in the months since Mary's death. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of mourning, but something more expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath to see what would happen next. He showed her to the spare room upstairs, a simple space with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the wheat fields toward the distant mountains. Mary had always said this would be a nursery someday, but they had never spoken of it after the doctor explained why children would not be possible for them. There's water in the pitcher, Tom said, setting down the small bundle of belongings that had been included with the sale. And I'll bring up some clothes that might fit. They belong to my wife. The woman nodded, then paused at the window, looking out at the view. She died recently? She asked, though it was more statement than question. 3 years ago, Tom replied, surprised by how easily the words came. Fever took her during a bad winter. I am sorry for your loss, she said simply. And something in her tone suggested she understood loss in ways that went far deeper than polite condolences. That night, Tom lay awake in his own bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the house. He could hear the soft whisper of footsteps overhead, the creak of floorboards, the gentle closing of a door. For the first time in years, he was not alone with his memories and regrets. Meanwhile, in the room above, the woman who carried the name Sarah but knew herself as Ayanna, forever flowering in the Apache tongue, stood at the window looking out at the moonlit landscape. She had not expected kindness from the man who bought her freedom, had braced herself for the worst and hoped for something merely tolerable. But there had been something in Thomas Mitchell's manner, a gentleness that spoke of grief understood rather than pity offered. Her own grief was a living thing, carried in her bones and blood. She was indeed the last of her particular band, the final survivor of a community that had been scattered to the four winds by soldiers who saw only savages where she saw family, friends, an entire world of meaning and connection. Her parents, her siblings, her husband and daughter, all gone, claimed by bullets or disease, or the slow death of displacement. The auction block had been merely the latest humiliation in a series of losses that had begun 4 years earlier when the cavalry found their hidden canyon home. She had survived by being away from the camp when the attack came, gathering medicinal plants in the high places where her grandmother had taught her to find the healing herbs that grew nowhere else. By the time she returned, the silence told her everything. Smoke still rose from the burned wickiups, and the ravens had already begun their work. She had found her daughter's body in the ruins of their home, still clutching the doll that Ayanna had made from scraps of leather and precious beads traded from distant tribes. For days she had stayed in the canyon, preparing the dead for their journey to the spirit world according to the old ways, singing the songs that would guide them safely to the ancestors. When the soldiers finally returned to search for survivors, she had offered no resistance. What was the point? Everything worth fighting for was already gone. The months that followed had been a blur of military posts and government officials, of forms filled out by men who could not be bothered to learn her real name, of decisions made about her fate by people who saw her as a problem to be solved, rather than a human being with her own will and desires. The auction had been presented as an act of mercy, a chance for her to earn her keep in civilized society rather than waste away on a reservation hundreds of miles from anything she had ever known. Now, looking out at the wheat fields that rustled like whispered prayers in the night breeze, Ayanna found herself wondering if this strange turn of fate might offer something she had not dared hope for. The possibility of beginning again. The first weeks at the Mitchell farm unfolded with the careful politeness of strangers sharing space. Tom rose before dawn as was his custom, tending to the animals and beginning the day's work in the fields. Ayanna, who continued to answer to Sarah in his presence, not yet ready to share the deeper parts of herself, took on the household tasks that had been neglected during his years of solitary living. She discovered that Mary Mitchell had been a woman of simple tastes but careful attention to detail. The kitchen was organized with logical efficiency, the larder stocked with preserves and dried goods that spoke of methodical preparation for lean times. The house had not been dirty exactly, but it carried the subtle marks of a man living alone, dust in the corners where a woman's eye would have caught it, dishes washed but not put away with care, the general absence of small touches that make a house into a home. Ayanna found herself restoring these details almost without conscious thought. She swept and polished, organized and tidied, but more than that, she began to understand the rhythms of this new life. She learned that Tom liked his coffee strong and black, that he favored simple meals but appreciated them well prepared, that he had a tendency to lose himself in his work and forget to eat unless reminded. For his part, Tom found himself adjusting to the presence of another person with surprising ease. There was something peaceful about hearing movement in the kitchen while he worked outside, about coming in for the midday meal to find the table set and food waiting. But more than the practical benefits, there was something about Sarah's presence that seemed to ease the sharp edges of his solitude. She moved through the house with a quiet grace that reminded him of deer he sometimes glimpsed at the edge of his fields, alert, ready to flee, but beautiful in their wariness. She spoke little during those first weeks, but when she did, her words carried weight. She wasted nothing. Not food, not water, not words. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, however, were not adjusting to the situation with the same equanimity. Word of Tom's purchase had spread quickly through the community, spawning rumors and speculation that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some said he had lost his mind with grief and loneliness. Others suggested darker motives, whispering about the impropriety of a white man living alone with an Apache woman. Mrs. Henderson made it her mission to gather intelligence, dispatching her daughter Rebecca to call upon Tom with a basket of preserves and instructions to observe everything possible. Rebecca returned with disappointing news for her mother's gossip mill. The house was clean, the woman was properly dressed in Mary's old clothes, and there were no signs of impropriety or madness. Still, the whispers persisted. When Tom came to town for supplies, he found conversations stopping abruptly upon his arrival, replaced by overly cheerful greetings that fooled no one. Mr. Patterson, who ran the general store, served him with professional courtesy but none of the casual friendliness they had shared in years past. "Folks are talking, Tom," Patterson said quietly as he tallied the bill for flour and sugar. "Some are wondering if you've thought this through." Tom met his eyes steadily. "I don't recall asking for their thoughts on my personal affairs, Bill." "No, I suppose you didn't," Patterson replied, then lowered his voice further. "But you might want to know that Jake Morrison and his boys have been drinking at the Silver Dollar, talking about how the Apache wars ain't really over as long as there's still one of them living free in our territory." Tom's jaw tightened. Jake Morrison was a former cavalry sergeant who had stayed in the territory after his discharge, making his living as a hired gun for anyone willing to pay for his particular skills. He had a reputation for violence and a particular hatred for Indians that had earned him promotions during the Apache campaigns. "Sarah's not living free," Tom said carefully. "She's living on my land, under my protection." "That's what I told them," Patterson nodded. "But Jake's not the reasonable type, as you well know." Tom completed his purchases in thoughtful silence, then loaded his wagon and headed home with Morrison's threat weighing on his mind. He had not considered that his act of conscience might place Sarah in greater danger than she had already faced, and the thought troubled him deeply. That evening, as they sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table eating supper, he decided to broach the subject. "There's been talk in town," he said carefully, "some of it not friendly. If you wanted to move on, find somewhere else to start over, I'd understand." Ayanna looked up from her plate, studying his face with those amber-flecked eyes. "Is that what you want me to do?" "No," Tom said, surprising himself with the immediacy and certainty of his response. "No, I don't want you to go." "Then I will stay," she said simply, and returned to her meal. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, Ayanna allowed herself to remember the dreams that had been visiting her with increasing frequency. They were not the nightmares of trauma that had plagued her sleep in the months following the destruction of her band, but something else, visions that carried the texture of prophecy. In these dreams, she stood on a high mesa overlooking a vast landscape of golden grassland and distant mountains. The wind carried familiar voices, speaking in the old language, telling her that her journey was not yet complete. Her grandmother appeared, as she had in life, her weathered hands working with plant medicine, while her voice shared ancient wisdom. "Little flower," the old woman said, using Ayanna's childhood name, "the roots must go deep before the plant can grow tall. You have found good soil. Now you must decide whether to take root or let the wind carry you to another place." "But grandmother," Ayanna replied in the dream, "I am alone. My people are scattered like seeds in a storm." "Look closer." Her grandmother smiled, and suddenly the golden grassland was filled with figures, not Apache, but people of all kinds, moving across the land with purpose and hope. "Family is not only blood, little one. Sometimes the spirits send us new relations when the old ones have gone ahead to wait for us." Ayanna woke from these dreams with a sense of possibility that both frightened and excited her. For the first time since the destruction of her old life, she was beginning to imagine a future that held something more than mere survival. It was during the fourth week of her residence at the Mitchell farm that circumstances put this growing sense of possibility to the test. Tom had been working since sunrise, repairing fence posts damaged by a recent storm. The work was hot and tedious, requiring him to dig new post holes in ground that had been baked hard by the summer Sunday. He had removed his shirt and was taking a break in whatever shade he could find when he heard the sound of riders approaching. Three men on horseback crested the rise between his property and the main road, moving at a leisurely pace that somehow managed to seem more threatening than urgency would have. Tom recognized the lead rider immediately, Jake Morrison, exactly as Bill Patterson had warned him. The other two were Morrison's usual companions, Pete Rawlings and Clem Tucker, both former soldiers who had found civilian life less satisfying than the clear-cut violence of their military service. Tom pulled on his shirt and walked toward the house, not hurrying but not dawdling either. Through the kitchen window, he could see Sarah moving away from the glass, though whether from caution or coincidence, he could not tell. Morrison brought his horse to a stop just outside the fence that marked Tom's yard, close enough to be clearly intrusive, but not quite close enough to constitute trespassing. He was a big man, running to fat now that he was no longer subject to military discipline, with the red face and prominent nose of a habitual drinker. His pale eyes held a coldness that Tom had seen before in men who had learned to enjoy killing. "Morning, Mitchell," Morrison called out in a voice that carried false cheer. "Thought we'd ride out and see how you're settling in with your new housekeeper." "Morning, Jake," Tom replied evenly. "What can I do for you?" Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's neighborly of you to ask. Thing is, some folks in town are concerned about having that Apache woman so close to decent families. Kids play in these fields sometimes, you know. Women walk the roads. Makes people nervous having one of them so close." "Sarah's not a threat to anyone," Tom said firmly. "She minds her own business and causes no trouble." "Sarah, is it?" Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that made his horse sidestep nervously. "That what they're calling themselves now? Sarah. That's rich." Pete Rawlings, a thin man with nervous hands that never seemed to settle in one place, spoke up. "Thing is, Mitchell, we fought a war to keep these people from killing white folks. Seems peculiar to invite one right into your home, if you don't mind my saying." "I do mind your saying," Tom replied. "And I didn't invite your opinions about my personal affairs." Morrison's false friendliness evaporated. "Maybe you should have thought about keeping it personal before you brought that savage into a Christian community. People have rights, Mitchell. Right to feel safe in their own homes." "And I have rights on my own property," Tom countered, "which you're currently trespassing on." The three men exchanged glances, and Tom could see Morrison calculating whether to push the confrontation further. Finally, the former sergeant seemed to reach some internal decision. "You're right, of course," Morrison said, his tone returning to false cordiality. "This is your land, and what you do on it is your business. But land ownership don't protect a man from the consequences of poor judgment. You might want to think about that." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, followed by his companions, but not before Clem Tucker spat contemptuously in the dust near Tom's feet. Tom stood watching until they disappeared over the rise, then turned to find Sarah standing in the kitchen doorway. Her face was pale but composed, and her hands were steady despite what she had undoubtedly overheard. "They will come back," she said simply. "Maybe," Tom acknowledged. "If they do, we'll deal with it." "We?" she asked, and something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. "Yes," he said after a moment. "We." That afternoon, as if the universe were testing their resolve, disaster struck the farm in the form of a summer fever that swept through Tom's small herd of cattle. He discovered the first sick animal during his evening rounds, a young heifer standing listlessly in the pasture, with her head down and her breathing labored. By the next morning, 3 more cattle showed similar symptoms. Tom had seen livestock diseases before, but never anything that moved through a herd so quickly or with such devastating effect. Within 2 days, he had lost 5 animals, representing a significant portion of his modest wealth and much of his plan for winter feed. He was standing in the pasture, staring at the latest casualty, when Sarah approached carrying a cloth bag that seemed to be filled with various plant materials. "What is that?" he asked, nodding toward the bag. Medicine, she said simply. For the animals. Tom frowned. Sarah, I appreciate the thought, but cattle diseases need a real veterinarian, not folk remedies. She looked at him steadily for a moment, then knelt beside the sick heifer and began examining the animal with gentle, experienced hands. She checked the cow's eyes, felt along her neck and flanks, and listened carefully to her breathing. This sickness comes from bad water, she said finally. The pond where they drink. Something has died there and poisoned the water. Tom considered this. He had been so focused on treating the symptoms that he hadn't thought to examine the cause. Even if that's true, how do you know what medicine to use? My grandmother taught me, Sarah replied, already beginning to prepare a mixture from the contents of her bag. Apache horses and cattle get sick just like white man's animals. The medicine is the same. Against his better judgment, Tom found himself helping her administer the herbal preparation to the afflicted animals. She worked with quiet confidence, her hands sure and gentle as she coaxed the sick cattle to accept the bitter-tasting remedy. That evening, she led him to the pond where his cattle drank, and sure enough, they found the bloated carcass of a deer that had apparently drowned during the recent storm. The stagnant water around it carried a smell that explained everything. How did you know? Tom asked, as they dragged the carcass away from the water source. The animals told me, she said. Then, seeing his expression, clarified. The way they breathed, the color of their tongues, the place where the sickness hurt them. My grandmother taught me to listen to what bodies say when they cannot speak with words. Within 3 days, the cattle that had received Sarah's treatment were noticeably improved. Within a week, they had recovered completely, while Tom's neighbors continued to lose animals to the same disease that was apparently spreading through the local water sources. Word of Sarah's success with the cattle spread through the community despite Tom's attempts to downplay her role. Farmers who had previously crossed the street to avoid him began stopping by, hat in hand, to ask if his housekeeper might take a look at their sick animals. Mrs. Henderson, whose pride and joy was a flock of laying hens, swallowed her disapproval long enough to request Sarah's help when a mysterious ailment began affecting her birds. Sarah spent an afternoon at the Henderson place, returning with payment in the form of fresh eggs and a grudging acknowledgement from the banker's wife that the Indian woman seems to know something about animal doctoring. This recognition brought both relief and new complications. On one hand, the community's attitude towards Sarah began to shift from suspicion to cautious respect. She was no longer seen merely as Tom's questionable charity case, but as someone who possessed useful skills. On the other hand, her growing reputation attracted attention from people like Jake Morrison, who saw her increasing acceptance as a threat to their worldview. The confrontation Tom had been dreading came on a scorching afternoon in late August. He was working in the barn, repairing harness leather, when he heard horses approaching at a gallop. This time, Morrison had brought reinforcements. 6 men in total, armed and clearly looking for trouble. Tom stepped out of the barn to find them arranged in a semicircle around his front yard, blocking any escape routes. Morrison sat his horse in the center of the group, his face flushed with heat and alcohol, his eyes holding the glassy shine of a man who had worked himself up to violence. "Time for a reckoning, Mitchell," Morrison called out. "This has gone on long enough." "What exactly has gone on too long, Jake?" Tom replied, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "You know damn well what I'm talking about," Morrison snarled. "That savage woman you're harboring. She's got no business being here, and you've got no business protecting her. As I've said before, that's not your decision to make." Morrison's hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Maybe not, but some decisions get made by men with the backbone to make them, whether they're legal or not." It was then that Sarah stepped out of the house behind Tom, carrying his old hunting rifle with the casual competence of someone familiar with firearms. She didn't point it at anyone, but her message was clear enough. "You brought a lot of men to threaten 2 people, Jake," Tom observed. "Must be you're not as confident in your position as you'd like everyone to believe." Morrison's face darkened further. "You think that rifle scares me, Mitchell? You think that savage knows how to use it?" "I know she does," Tom replied calmly. "Question is, do you know how many of your boys are willing to die over your personal vendetta?" For a moment, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Tom could see Morrison weighing his options, calculating odds, trying to decide if his hatred was worth the risk of calling Tom's bluff. The other men shifted uneasily in their saddles, suddenly less certain about the wisdom of following Morrison into what might become a shooting war. It was Clem Tucker who broke the stalemate. "Jake," he said quietly, "maybe we should think this through a bit more." "Shut up, Clem," Morrison snapped, but some of the fire had gone out of his voice. "I'm just saying," Tucker continued, emboldened by his friend's momentary uncertainty. "Maybe there's a better way to handle this. Legal way." Morrison stared at Tom and Sarah for a long moment, his jaw working silently. Finally, he seemed to reach some internal decision. "This isn't over, Mitchell," he said, gathering his reins. "Not by a long shot." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, followed by his companions, leaving Tom and Sarah standing in the dust and heat of the afternoon Sunday. "Thank you," Tom said quietly, and Sarah nodded without speaking. That night, as they sat on the front porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Tom found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed in the months since the auction. The solitude that had once seemed like protection now felt more like limitation. The farm that had been a refuge from the world now seemed like the foundation for something larger and more meaningful. "Tell me about your real name," he said suddenly. Sarah was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. Then, softly, she said, "Ayana. It means forever flowering in my language." "Ayana," Tom repeated, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. "It's beautiful." "My grandmother said names carry power," she replied. "She said I was given that name because some part of me would always find a way to bloom, no matter how hard the winter." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was. She taught me that healing comes not from fighting against what hurts us, but from finding ways to grow around the damage." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the farm, cattle settling for sleep, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through wheat. "Jake Morrison won't give up," Ayana said finally. "No," Tom agreed. "He won't." "What will we do?" Tom considered the question and realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply enduring it. "We'll face it together," he said. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." In the weeks that followed Morrison's confrontation, Tom and Ayana found themselves working in partnership in ways neither had anticipated. They developed systems and routines that maximized their combined strengths. Her knowledge of traditional medicine and his understanding of farming and livestock management, her ability to read the subtle signs of approaching weather, and his skill with tools and machinery. The harvest that year was the best Tom had managed in the 3 seasons since Mary's death. The wheat came in golden and full. The vegetables from Ayana's expanded kitchen garden provided abundant food for preservation, and the cattle that had survived the summer fever were now healthy and thriving under her continued care. As autumn progressed into winter, Tom found himself looking forward to the shorter days and longer evenings that would allow them more time to talk by the fireplace. Ayana had begun sharing stories of her people's traditions, painting pictures with words of a way of life that emphasized harmony between human needs and natural rhythms. In return, Tom found himself telling her about his dreams for the farm, about Mary and their hopes for children, about the loneliness that had shaped his adult life until she arrived to change everything. These conversations, conducted in the warm glow of firelight while wind howled around the sturdy walls of the house, became the foundation of something neither was yet ready to name. It was during one of these winter evenings that they heard horses approaching through the snow. Tom rose immediately, reaching for the rifle that now lived beside the fireplace, but Ayana placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Wait," she said, listening carefully to the sound. "Only one horse, and the rider is hurt." She was right. When Tom opened the door, he found young Billy Patterson, the storekeeper's son, half frozen and barely conscious, clinging to his horse's neck. The boy was burning with fever, and his right leg was bent at an unnatural angle. Without hesitation, Ayana took charge of the situation. She directed Tom to help her get Billy into the house and onto the kitchen table, then began examining his injuries with gentle, professional competence. "The leg is broken," she said after a careful inspection, "but not too badly. It will heal if we set it properly. The fever is more dangerous. It comes from infection in the wound on his arm." Tom looked at the angry red streak spreading from a deep gash on Billy's forearm. Can you help him? Yes, Ayana said with quiet confidence. But we must work quickly. What followed was a long night of delicate work. Ayana cleaned and treated Billy's infected wound with preparations made from plants she had gathered during the autumn months. She set his broken leg with splints carved from wood scraps and secured with strips torn from one of Mary's old sheets. Throughout the night, she monitored his fever, adjusting his treatment based on subtle changes in his condition that Tom could not see but trusted her to recognize. By morning, Billy's fever had broken, and his breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of healing sleep. When Bill Patterson arrived looking for his son, he found the boy clean, bandaged, and resting comfortably in the Mitchell guest room. She saved his life, Patterson said to Tom as they stood watching Ayana check Billy's splints. Doc Morrison in town said there was nothing to be done, that the infection was too far advanced. But he shook his head in amazement. How did she know what to do? She's got knowledge, Tom replied simply. Knowledge worth respecting. Word of Billy Patterson's recovery spread through Cedar Ridge faster than gossip usually traveled. Within days, other people began arriving at the Mitchell farm seeking Ayana's help with various ailments. She treated them all with the same quiet competence she had shown Billy. A rancher's wife with persistent headaches, an elderly man whose arthritis had worsened with the cold weather, a young mother whose infant son suffered from a respiratory condition that had baffled the town doctor. In each case, Ayana's treatments proved effective where conventional medicine had failed. More importantly, she treated her patients with a dignity and respect that many had never experienced from white doctors. She listened carefully to their descriptions of their symptoms, explained what she was doing and why, and followed up on their progress with genuine concern. By spring, the community's attitude toward both Tom and Ayana had undergone a complete transformation. The woman who had once been seen as a dangerous savage was now regarded as a healer whose skills were invaluable to the health and welfare of the entire region. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid Tom now sought him out to ask when Ayana might be available to examine their animals or family members. This change in perception did not go unnoticed by Jake Morrison, who found his influence in the community diminishing as Ayana's grew. The former sergeant had built his post-military identity around his reputation as an Indian fighter, a man who had helped make the territory safe for white settlement. Now, the very people he claimed to have protected were turning to an Apache woman for help with their most pressing problems. Morrison's resentment festered through the winter months, fed by alcohol and the encouragement of the few men who still shared his views. By the time spring arrived, he had convinced himself that Ayana's growing influence represented a direct threat to everything he believed about the proper order of society. The final confrontation came in late April, when the wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the meadows around Cedar Ridge and the wheat fields were showing the first green shoots of new growth. Tom was in town purchasing supplies for spring planting when Morrison cornered him outside Patterson's store. This time, Morrison was alone, but the isolation seemed to have concentrated rather than diminished his hostility. His eyes held the glassy shine of a man who had been drinking steadily, and his hand rested openly on the butt of his pistol. "I hear your Apache witch is making house calls now," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly down the main street. "Poisoning decent folks with her savage medicines." Tom set down the bags of seed he had been loading into his wagon and turned to face Morrison directly. "Ayana has helped a lot of people in this town, Jake, including some who weren't too proud to ask. Helped them straight to hell, more likely," Morrison sneered. "That's what savages do. They corrupt everything they touch. First she corrupts you, then your neighbors. Then the whole territory goes back to being wilderness." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by Morrison's raised voice and aggressive posture. Tom could see Bill Patterson standing in his doorway, ready to intervene if necessary, and Mrs. Henderson watching from across the street with her hand pressed to her mouth. "The only person I see causing trouble here is you, Jake," Tom said calmly. "Ayana minds her own business and helps people who ask for her help. That's more than I can say for some folks." Morrison's face darkened. "You've let that woman bewitch you, Mitchell. Turn you against your own kind. But some of us remember what these people did during the wars. Some of us remember that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Then some of you need to learn the difference between the past and the present, Tom replied. The wars are over, Jake. It's time to move on. The wars are never over. Morrison snarled, his hand moving to grip his pistol. Not as long as there's still one of them left alive to corrupt decent people. The crowd tensed, sensing that the confrontation was about to turn violent. Several people began backing away, while others moved closer, reluctant to miss the drama but unwilling to intervene. It was then that Ayanna appeared, walking quietly down the street with a basket over her arm, apparently returning from visiting one of her patients. She stopped when she saw the crowd, taking in the situation with a glance that missed nothing. Morrison noticed her arrival at the same moment, and his eyes lit up with malicious satisfaction. "Well, look here," he called out loudly. "The savage herself comes to save her white protector." Ayanna approached calmly, setting down her basket and positioning herself beside Tom with natural grace. "I am not here to save anyone, mister Morrison," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the gathering crowd. "I am here because this is my home too." "Your home?" Morrison laughed harshly. "This will never be your home, savage. You're a parasite, feeding off the charity of fools and the gullibility of ignorant people who don't know any better." "I know better," said a voice from the crowd. It was Bill Patterson, stepping forward from his storefront. "I know my son would be dead if not for Ayanna's skill and kindness. And I know my wife's headaches are gone for the first time in years," added another man. "My cattle are healthier than they've been since I started ranching," called out someone else. One by one, other voices joined in, people stepping forward to publicly acknowledge the help they had received from Ayanna. The crowd that had initially gathered to witness a confrontation was transforming into something else, a community standing up for one of its own. Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing his support evaporating in real time. His hand tightened on his pistol, and for a moment Tom thought the man might actually draw his weapon against such overwhelming opposition. Instead, Morrison seemed to deflate slightly, the wind going out of his sails as he realized how isolated his position had become. "You're all fools," he said bitterly. "You'll regret this. When she shows her true nature, when she turns on you like a wild animal, you'll remember I warned you." He turned and walked away, pushing through the crowd with rough, angry movements. But there was defeat in his posture, the recognition that his moment had passed and would not come again. As the crowd began to disperse, Tom felt Ayanna slip her hand briefly into his. It was a simple gesture, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but it carried the weight of partnership acknowledged and trust confirmed. That evening, as they sat on their front porch watching the sun set over the wheat fields, Tom found himself thinking about the changes that a single year had brought to his life. The loneliness that had once seemed like his permanent condition now felt like a distant memory. The farm that had been merely a place to work and survive had become a home worth defending. "Do you think Morrison will cause more trouble?" Ayanna asked, as if reading his thoughts. Tom considered the question. "I think Jake Morrison is a man living in the past, fighting wars that ended years ago. That kind of thinking has a way of destroying the people who hold on to it." "And us?" she asked. "What kind of people are we?" Tom looked at her profile silhouetted against the darkening sky, this woman whose presence had transformed his world in ways he was still discovering. "I think we're the kind of people who build things instead of tearing them down, who choose to look forward instead of backward. My grandmother would say we are people who have learned to bloom where we are planted," Ayanna said softly. "Your grandmother sounds right," Tom replied. As the stars began to appear in the vast western sky, Tom found himself thinking about the future in ways that would have been impossible just a year earlier. There would be challenges ahead. There always were in frontier life, but they would face them together, drawing strength from the partnership they had forged in the crucible of adversity. The last Apache woman had indeed found a home, not through the transaction that had brought her to Cedar Ridge, but through the slower, more profound process of becoming part of a community that valued her for who she was rather than what she represented. And Thomas Mitchell had discovered that the end of loneliness came not from the mere presence of another person, but from the recognition of kinship that transcended the boundaries of race, culture, and history. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, and somewhere in the darkness, another answered. The sound carried across the wheat fields and pasture land, across the small towns and vast spaces of the territory. A reminder that in this wide country, there was room for all kinds of survivors, all kinds of families, all kinds of hope. The story that had begun with chains and an auction block had become something else entirely, a testament to the possibility of transformation, the power of compassion, and the enduring truth that home is not a place but a condition of the heart. Two solitary souls had found each other across the divide of loss and difference, and in so doing had created something new under the endless western sky.